That is why we're seeing this rally in stocks, because of the expectation that we'll get a 25 basis point hike as opposed to 50, as opposed to 75. Brandon, we'll see what the Fed brings us on Tuesday and Wednesday next week, but this is all about the Fed, this major gain for these averages year to date. NASDAQ up 10% since January 1.
Yeah, I do think that I would agree with Cheryl here. This pushes us more in the 25 basis point conversation here. But the concern is, I really go back to what Maya said earlier, and that is, spending has driven inflation. There's no question about it. And despite all of the actions of the Fed, extremely aggressive actions by this Fed, we've seen Congress basically rowing in the opposite direction, pushing trillions and trillions of dollars out the door in the form of stimulus funds for COVID, but just in terms of increasing spending 25% almost over the past 2 years. We need to put everything on the table. That means Social Security. That means Medicare. That means defense. If we take all those items off the table, we're not going to be able to make the sufficient cuts that we need to get inflation under control, to drive it back down below 2% where it was pre-pandemic.
Yeah, Congresswoman Hinson, do you agree with all of this?
Well, I think what we need to be looking at here is those numbers that we were just hearing about from Maya. When you look at the savings rates and the impact on our consumers, the impact on our constituents back home, that spending that has been out of control over the last 2 years is a direct result of Democrat policies that are failing the American consumer. Iowans are telling me when they go to the grocery store, it's more expensive to make breakfast. They're holding back money at home because they're worried about paying their utility bills and heating their homes in the middle of winter. So absolutely, we need to rein in our spending and get this under control in Congress. Also, we need to take a look at the regulatory side, because if there's one thing that is driving costs for our consumers and for our businesses, it's overregulation. And we're going to see a Biden administration, now that we have a Republican Congress, try to be more aggressive with rules and executive orders. So that is something we're absolutely watching very closely, because as you consider all of these things in the pie of solutions, the accountability here for the Biden administration is going to be absolutely critical to make sure they don't try to circumvent Congress in its role in this discussion.
Well, I mean, it's been all about the Fed doing anything on inflation, Congresswoman. The federal government has not helped the Fed at all with all of this new spending. Let me ask you, has all of the COVID money been spent that was appropriated, Congresswoman? Because that $1.9 trillion package back in March of 2021 was the root cause of things getting out of control in terms of spending in this last 2-year period.
Absolutely. And as a result of that, we've seen those inflation numbers with that increased government spending, even all the way down to the local level, just skyrocket, right? And President Biden is the inflation president. I want to be very clear about that. These economic policies have taken our country in the wrong direction. Inflation is not transitory. Inflation is persistent, and it is impacting Iowans and Americans every single day with the bottom line purchases. Biden's breakfast bust. I like to talk about this. When did it cost so much to make breakfast? Eggs. My son ate 5 eggs the other day, and I about had a panic attack because the price of eggs has gone up so much. And I know other American families are facing that same concern. So we need to get real. I mean, I think the amount of spending that we saw happen in the last 2 years, trillions and trillions of dollars, clearly sent our country down the wrong path. And we need to make sure that the money that is not being spent is clawed back however we can. And we are doing a full accounting of that because many of our states and municipalities are still sitting on cash.
Well, I mean, look, if Biden is the inflation president, are you going to be the debt control Congress?
Well, we certainly hope so. And again, that's our economic plan, Maria, is to rein in this spending, this out of control spending, provide relief for American working families. Again, take a look at the regulatory environment and get serious about these problems. We need to be a check on the out of control checkbook that we've seen over the last 2 years, coming from a Democrat controlled Congress and a Democrat administration.
Tomas, I want to get your take on what the growth story is here, because one question that I've been asking is, what is Joe Biden's growth plan? I feel that there is not an actual growth plan that has been communicated to the American people. I realize he's been selling oil from the Strategic Oil Reserve, but beyond that, what is the growth plan?
Yeah, I think it's largely missing. And the sad part is that we've seen, despite the boosting about how great the economy is, we've seen real wage declines the last 2 years. We have a little uptick here the last couple of months, but we're going to see probably more real wage declines, not because prices are rising faster than wages, but because the wage is going to probably take a hit. We're now coming into sort of, this has kind of been a boy who cried wolf recession. A lot of economists thought it's going to happen in Q3 last year, or then Q4, and then now Q1. People are pushing it into the later part of 2023. And I think, we're starting to see now with December, with retail sales down, industrial production down, housing is obviously down, et cetera. And now today we have revised consumer spending. It's starting to look like we're finally into this downturn, which is going to be very sad for real wages going forward. And you're right. I don't think they have any plan to essentially reverse that.
Yeah, and that's what I've been looking for. Maya, can you identify a growth plan? Or should we not be talking about growth when we're talking about debt?
Right. So I would think that the administration would say that their growth plan is a whole lot of new spending, which they would call investments, because that's what you call spending you like. And then they would argue that they are willing to pay for it with a lot of taxes on the very rich. And we've seen that in the president's budget, and his budget will come out soon. It will be late, unfortunately, but it will come out soon. I think what you really have is two incredibly different visions of how you grow the economy. And in some ways, they're different. Their preferences, they're legitimate. But I would say that growth fueled by spending and borrowing in an inflationary period is not going to work. And so that's a big problem. Something you asked was, how is this Congress, is the House going to fare during this? I've been really encouraged to see how much the fiscal issue has been brought up in these beginning weeks. I've been really encouraged that Chairman Arrington, the chairman of the Budget Committee, seems very, very focused on putting out a budget, which, let me remind the country, we didn't even have budget committees that released budgets last year, which is incredibly reckless. We cannot run our country without a budget. So I'm very eager to see the work of the budget committees. Hopefully the Senate will do the same. They will lay out what I would imagine to be very different paths. And then we do the work that you're supposed to do in budgeting of assessing the trade-offs and figuring out what we want to spend on, and if so, are we willing to pay for it rather than borrow? But I think it's also important that this discussion happen well in advance of the debt ceiling limit, like the last moment this summer. Let's not wait until the last moment. Let's have these discussions now. Let's not even mention default. It shouldn't be on the table. But let's take really seriously that this is a great opportunity to make some of these much-needed fiscal improvements.
Yeah, it's a great point. And Brandon, I think that's what investors would like to see as well. Your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we need now is a comprehensive strategy to assessing our national debt. The fact that Democrats won't even engage on this, the president is burying his head in the sand. That's very frustrating. You look just a week ago, this president was out there crowing about reducing the deficit to the tune of $350 billion. Now, I think that was completely disingenuous. But back then, way back a week ago, he thought deficit reduction was a good idea. And now when Republicans try to engage in these conversations, he's saying we can't do so because we can't risk our nation's credit worthiness. I think this is ridiculous. I think our nation's credit worthiness will be improved. I think markets will be strengthened. I think broadly speaking, the economy will be strengthened if we can reach a bipartisan consensus to put this country back on the fiscal track it ought to be on.
Well, I mean, what kind of arrogance is this? I mean, to say I'm not going to discuss identifying areas to cut spending. I mean, excuse me, that's your job.
That's how Congress works. That's how the political process works. People have disagreements. They sit down, they hash them out, they come up with compromise solutions, and we move on from there. To completely remove himself from this process is just an absence of leadership. Our nation has $31.4 trillion in national debt right now. We've maxed out our credit cards. Of course, we need to engage in a conversation about how to fix this enormous problem.
Yeah, I mean, Sharon.